By 2060, the sci-fi movies promised us flying cars, robots and shooting through vacuum tubes. The reality looks more like this. Our population on track to hit 40 million within the next 40 years. The good news, we're all living longer and healthier. The latest intergenerational report out this week will show the number of Aussies over 65 is set to more than double, while those over 85 will triple. The average life expectancy rising to 87 years for men and just under 90 for women.
I'm optimistic about the future, but we need to adapt and understand the big challenges which are underway.
Which brings us to the not-so-good news. We're having fewer children. Our population's set to grow at its slowest rate since Federation. The Treasurer today highlighting
Our care economy will become an even more central focus in the decades ahead.
And while migration is expected to help the population grow, that too is set to fall.
We've historically struggled to get Australians into low-paid care work. Should we expect Australia is going to need to ratchet up net overseas migration to fill those jobs?
Our first priority is to train more Australians for these opportunities, but migration will play a role as well.
The government is really walking this fine line because on the right of politics there is a growing consternation about migration. On the far left you also get extreme arguments to effectively stop population in its tracks.
So as Aussies live longer and the costs blow out, will young people today pay the heaviest price in the future?
Poor old millennials have been copping it from boomers over the last 20 years. We move on to the 2060s, it'll be the millennials, whichever next generation is going to be picking up their tab, they're going to be the ones saying, what the hell's going on?
Kos Samaras is a former Labor strategist and now social researcher. Kos, this is set to add an extra $140 billion to the budget every year. Where should that money come from?
You either really got two options. You either broaden the tax base via population growth or you raise taxes. The problem the governments have now is that they have significant issues in addressing both of those fronts.
That's broadening the tax-based conversation is really interesting because at the moment, workers get taxed quite a lot. What would you do? Would you keep increasing the tax on workers or would you find other things to tax, which will no doubt not be very popular either? Like, which rein would you pull?
The problem we've got is that people are not having enough kids anymore. So the amount of people who are at a working age that will be available for governments to tax is going to shrink unless people start having children in greater numbers, and that's not happening, or migration is exponentially increased. And of course, we know the social impacts that may have in terms of housing and so on.
Do you think there's a way we could encourage young people to have more kids, though? Maybe put up posters saying "get into it" or something.
The problem the millennials and Gen Z are now face is that they are eating into their savings. They have significant mortgages. They can't buy homes. That actually has an exponential impact on people's decision not to have kids or to have less kids. So unless we solve the housing crisis and the cost of living crisis that is strongly associated with that, we aren't going to be able to encourage anyone to have more kids. So
the other option you mentioned is migration. And presumably what happens is whatever we don't do with having kids, we'll make up for with migration. Is there an ideal mix? If you could make it all done with having kids or mostly done with migration, what would you choose?
The governments will need to spend the next, I would say, 3 or 4 decades unscrabbling the egg that's been scrambled over the last 4 decades, and that is position these generations that we've been talking about at the front and centre of every single solution that is offered up by government. And what I mean by that, there needs to be a shift away from focusing on people with assets and focusing on helping people without assets. That then lessens the burden on these generations, and at the same time you're able to complement that with some migration as well. That's your perfect mix, but it's going to take a lot of hard work.
I'm starting to feel very nervous in this conversation.
Wow.
Well, they can concentrate on assets. That means they're going to look at things like if you've got a superannuation nest egg, that will be more likely to be taxed more heavily. You might even be thinking, Kos, maybe, a death tax or an inheritance tax, things like that are what governments are going to look at. And I get a sense, Kos, that Anthony Albanese and his government and Jim Chalmers are doing that right now.
I think with regards to this particular government, I think they don't need to make those decisions yet. What they need to do is address housing and all those other issues that we've been talking about.
How much would you tax Steve's private jet?
Please, with those jokes.
No, come on. No, it's a serious question. The nation needs to know, Kos.
No, Kos doesn't need to answer that.
That's right. I'll skip that question.
Thank you, mate.
This
Well
is
done.
the problem. Government won't answer the hard questions, Kos.
He's a smart man.
That's right. Well, I mean,
Kos, thanks so much for your time.
no problem. Thank you.